we'll get started. So again, my name is Allison Smith. I'm with the UVM Extension 4-H program. I'm really excited to be with you all today for the Vermont Teen Science Exploration. And I just want to welcome everyone who's here. We have Sage coming back from Maine and Jacob from New Mexico. So cool. Palin from Morris, Illinois. Anna from Essex, Vermont. We have someone else from Illinois, Natalie, welcome. And we have Kenna here today from UVM, and I'll be introducing her in a moment as well. And so as you're coming in, thanks for continuing to type your name in the chat box and letting us know where you're from. We really appreciate it. We love knowing where everyone is coming from. So I just wanted to go over a few of the protocols for today's meeting. You're going to be muted because we're in a webinar style, and that's just so that we have enough bandwidth and our presenter can present. However, that does not mean that you have to be quiet. We love questions. So we have both the question and answer box. So as Kenna is presenting, if you have a question, feel free to type it in the question and answer box, and then it'll pop up. If it's a question that pertains to something that Kenna's talking about right at the moment, I might smoothly interrupt her and see if we can answer that question right away. Otherwise, we'll definitely keep some time at the end of our session of the presentation. And we love to answer all questions. But if you have the same question, you can also click a thumbs up on that question to upvote the question if that's something that you're interested in as well. And it just helps to let us know which questions you all are really interested in knowing. And Jacob, I see that you have a meeting at 2:30. This does go from 3:30 to, we usually finish up the latest 4:45, but what you can do is you can hang out, and then when you need to leave, you can bow out then, and hopefully we can answer your questions and give you some content. And sorry, I realize we're in different time zones with that question. So, but we're so glad you're here. And also, you've all found the chat box. So if you want to make a comment, or at times Kenna might ask a question that she invites you all to answer, then you're certainly welcome to do that as well. Type in the chat box. We just ask that you be courteous and respectful with the chat box, stay on topic. We're really excited to have Kenna here, and she was just telling me that she teaches a class of, I think she said over 100 students. She's got a lot on her plate. So it's really cool that she's spending the afternoon with us. And then we just ask that you limit any distractions, so like having random conversations and things in the chat box. And stay engaged and participate fully, but I'm not worried about it. I've tuned into these before, and I know that you all are super engaged. Just a reminder that you can catch some of our programming at our youth announcements page. There is a link at the bottom here for our announcements, and I will try to put that in the chat in a moment. But we have our 4-H Speak Up contest coming up, in which you can voice your opinion on what's important to you and your communities. I also hear there are some prizes to be won in the form of gift certificates, kind of cool. And our Youth Environmental Summit that Lauren runs is now open. There are 30+ topics that you can dive into about the environment, science, conservation, and it's using the platform Flipgrid. It's a really great way to get some cool content, interact with others, meet some professionals through videos that you can look at on your own time and learn more about careers and science. So I encourage you to check it out. And another reminder that the virtual Brain Club, brought to you by the Virtual Brain Bee, or Vermont Brain Bee, whoa, I'm really butchering that, is held each week. So that's another great science-y opportunity that you can check out. And I see that there are some questions coming in through the chat box, and I'll definitely be happy to answer those once I hand it off to Kenna. And final opportunities is we have our Zuma Scientists, which also comes out of the Sea Grant Lake Champlain program, coming up on Tuesday, November 10th. They're having Managing Lamprey in the Lake Champlain Basin. And then also our friends over in Maine, shout out to them. They also have teen science cafes and some great topics coming up as well. So without further ado, today's topic is very relevant and exciting: climate change and plant nutrients. Will the grass be greener on the other side? And I'd love to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about our presenter today. So Kenna Rewcastle is a PhD student in the Rubenstein School at the University of Vermont, where she is pursuing her doctorate in natural resources. Originally from Tennessee, Kenna earned her bachelor's degree in ecology from the University of Tennessee and spent a year working in Sweden studying the impacts of reindeer grazing on the carbon cycle as a Fulbright Fellow. Her research links experiments that study the effects of climate change to land management applications, helping to protect and conserve mountain ecosystems into the future. She enjoys both working and playing in the mountains, spending her free time snowboarding, rock climbing, and mountain biking. So Kenna, thank you so much for being here today. I'm gonna stop sharing and hand things over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. If everyone can bear with me for just a second while I share my screen. Does that look good to you, Allison?
Yeah, it looks great.
Awesome. Fantastic. Okay, well, I want to thank you all for being here today. I know I am really thankful for the opportunity to shut down the 15 browser tabs of election results and talk about my science and my research that I'm really passionate about. And I hope that this is a nice break from kind of election mayhem if you've been following that at home. So I'm talking to you guys from Winooski, Vermont, and I'm really excited to see that there are people from across the country today. That's really cool. And I'd love to, these results that I'll be talking about are from some of my research around the world. And so it's really cool that we are all living in different ecosystems right now. So you can think about how the things I'm discussing about the nitrogen cycle apply to your home ecosystem, if you will, specifically. Yeah, I just want to start off. I use she, her pronouns if any of you have questions about that. And I am an ecosystem ecologist. So when people say, what do you do? That's my response. Sometimes I say I'm just a scientist, but if my specific brand of science, if you will, I'm an ecosystem ecologist. And so this word ecologist, I actually was like unfamiliar with until I started college. And so I'm wondering if you guys in the chat could tell me like what you think an ecologist is and what ecology is the study of. So let me see, and I wish I could see the chat. So you guys get those answers going in there and I will try and find my chat.
All right, so Zoe just said studies nature. They're coming in fast and furious now. Oliver says someone who studies ecosystems, and Lily mentioned ecosystems as well.
Yeah, so you guys really nailed it. Ecology is this study of not only all of the biology in an ecosystem, all of the organisms that live there, but also how they interact with one another and they interact with their physical environment. So how climate impacts these things or how soil properties impacts what kinds of organisms live in an ecosystem. And so an ecosystem ecologist is essentially an ecologist but at a pretty big scale. So I specifically study how all of the things that live and work in an ecosystem affect the big scale fluxes of things like carbon and nutrients and how those cycle through an ecosystem at kind of a landscape scale. So I study things at a scale of, what would happen in an entire region or an entire biome. And just a little bit about me and my journey to becoming an ecosystem ecologist. As Allison mentioned, I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So that's the southern end of the same Appalachian Mountains that many of you Vermonters hike in the Green Mountains. And I got my degree at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So like I said before, like I had no idea what ecology was until I started college and started taking some of these classes almost by happen chance. So I thought, science in high school and middle school was really just memorizing chemical formulas and the structure of a cell and what are the steps of photosynthesis. And I quickly realized that ecology was actually this way of combining my two passions together, being outside and doing science. And so I found this field that really blended those two together perfectly and ran with that. I said, this is what I want to do as a career, and kind of fueled my passion moving forward. And I spent a lot of time hiking. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is in my backyard growing up. And so these questions, these ecological questions that really stuck with me most, I think, were the ones that addressed mountain ecosystems, because that's where I spent a lot of my free time. And those are the ecosystems that I spent a lot of time observing. And in college and beyond, studying ecology has really been my ticket to explore the world. So this is a map of a climate change experiment that I am studying now in my PhD, but I got to interact with this some as an undergraduate, and I got to basically get paid to go travel to some really cool places during my summers and collect samples and just spend time in the mountains, which was incredible. So these are just a couple of snapshots. I've been to 4 of these sites in this experimental network of 10 different sites. This is a picture of me in the Swiss Alps in Davos, Switzerland. So mountains are a little bit taller and snowier than we have here in Vermont, but some of you in the West might recognize these sorts of landscapes. And then I spent some time above the Arctic Circle in Abisko, Sweden. So this is what kind of a picture taken. This was actually taken at 11 p.m. at night. So in the Arctic Circle, the sun is up almost around the clock in the summer months. So we took advantage of that by getting a lot of hikes in after our work day was done. And I also got to travel to Narsarsuaq, Greenland. So you can see these little kind of glowing white shapes on that dark landscape. Those are actually some of the warming chambers that we use to kind of simulate climate change on the ecosystem. So I'll talk more about those later. And where I spend most of my time doing my research now as a PhD student is in the Colorado Rockies. And so this is a picture of me in the green hat kind of in the back, and some of the undergraduate students that work with me every summer to study climate change in the Colorado Rockies. So after undergrad, I worked for a year as a lab technician. So basically, I was just helping other graduate students process their samples and take measurements. But that took me to Costa Rica. So this picture on the right is a picture of me in the jungle in Costa Rica, which was a crazy experience. There are so many different things in these ecosystems. And it's kind of this ecological shiny key syndrome that's going on. Should I think about the plants, or should I think about all of these crazy insects or birds or monkeys that are all kind of make up the communities in these jungles? But I was really studying how roots in the tropical forest impact the carbon cycle. So you can see in this left picture, all of the tiny little hairs that are extending from this root allow that root to really maximize how much water, nutrients, other things it can take up. And Allison briefly mentioned this in my bio, but then one of my favorite things that I've had the opportunity to do was to go to Sweden for a year and work as a Fulbright fellow. So these are grants that you can apply for as Americans do go to a variety of different countries around the world and spend a year doing research. And so I was studying reindeer, which seems kind of unique, I'm sure, to most of you. But reindeer really are like the livestock of Sweden. So if you went to northern Sweden and you went to a big field like you would in Colorado, you wouldn't see cows grazing, you would see reindeer grazing. And they actually are able to smell the lichen, the kind of crusty moss-looking stuff that grows. You might see that on like rocks on Mount Mansfield or something like that. They can smell the lichen through the snowpack in the winter. So this lichen, even though it's not super big, it's not super nutritious, but it is the main staple of the reindeer diet in the wintertime. So studying links between reindeer grazing and the lichen is a really important question in these Swedish ecosystems. And now I continued my dirt research as a PhD student at studying natural resources at UVM. So mostly in Colorado, again, these pictures are all from Colorado, but this is what kind of my fieldwork looks like. In the summer, I can usually be found digging a hole somewhere, as you can see on the right, getting really, really covered in my science, the picture on the left, and also just kind of a glorified pack mule hiking all of this equipment around through the mountains, which is that picture in the middle. And when I'm not working in the mountains, I am definitely playing in the mountains. So this picture on the left is me split boarding in the Vermont backcountry. I also really love rock climbing and have recently gotten into mountain biking, which is a ton of fun. And I call him Cedar the pandemic pup. So I just got a new puppy, and that's my partner Gabby with our puppy. So we enjoy spending a lot of time outside in Vermont. So now to what I've dedicated spending 4 years of my life studying. My big research theme is investigating the impact of climate change on nitrogen cycling in mountains. And that's a really glorified way of saying I study the way one single element moves through ecosystems with climate change and over time, and what kind of properties of an ecosystem affect how that nutrient moves through the ecosystem. And I hope with all the beautiful pictures of the mountain ranges that I study, you can kind of maybe to yourself justify why someone might spend 4 years studying one element. I study that element in really beautiful places. But beyond that, a really important question that I think that we should talk about is why study nitrogen? Why is that one element so important that it justifies spending so much time studying how it moves through an ecosystem? And this is a picture of plant cells with these little green spheres in here. So I was wondering if you guys in the chat could tell me what you think these little green spheres in the plant cells in this picture are. Let's see if I can.
Anna guess chloroplasts. We have chlorophyll. Lily says a nucleus. And Victoria also guessed chloroplast.
Yeah, you guys are absolutely right. So those, if you go back to your structure of the cell, those are absolutely a bunch of chloroplasts in that plant cell. And actually what makes those organelles green, as some of you mentioned, it's the chlorophyll. So that's the pigment that is really essential in trapping sunlight and allowing plants to use sunlight to produce their own food and to capture solar energy, essentially. And the green in there is from that nitrogen. So if plants don't have nitrogen, they can't make chlorophyll, they can't fill their chloroplasts with the chlorophyll, and they can't photosynthesize. So this link between nitrogen and ability for plants to grow is really essential. And you can actually see the impact of using nitrogen fertilizer from space. So this is a Google Earth image of an experiment at Tulik. So this is a research station in Alaska. So this is like the Alaskan tundra in the summertime, of course. And some of these plots have been fertilized. And so I was able to just type in the coordinates in Google Images or Google Earth and take a screenshot, and you can see these strips. There's kind of 4 strips of plots, and those are replicates. So they, apply fertilizer to 4 different plots. They're kind of just monitoring 4 different plots without adding fertilizer. And they even have plots that get like a lot of fertilizer and some only get a little bit of fertilizer. So there's a gradient of how much fertilizer is applied. And this brings us to our first poll question of this afternoon. Which of these plots do you think have been fertilized with nitrogen? Plot A up at the top here in this red square, plot B in the yellow, or plot C in the blue?
All right, and I'm launching the poll right now. So you should see a box pop up that you can choose your answer. If you don't see a box for some reason, feel free to put it in the chat. And I'm just going to let a few more results come in, and then I will end the poll so that I can share out the results. All right, last call here. Looks like we almost have everybody. And I think if I hit this button, all right, let's see. Let me share the results. So it looks like plot A is in the lead.
Yeah, and you guys are right. Plot A is definitely the plot that has been fertilized. And why did you guys pick plot A? What about plot A kind of screamed this plot has been fertilized with nitrogen to you, especially thinking about the picture we just saw in the previous slide? Yeah, you guys are totally right. It's greener. You nailed it. So this is really just kind of visual evidence of you add nitrogen to these plots, the plants take that up and they use that nitrogen to make chlorophyll and to make chloroplasts and to grow more. And so those plots are greener. They've got more nitrogen, they are greener. And you can see that from space. And so if, in case you just want some hard numbers, you don't trust these screenshots that I grabbed from Google Earth, here is a graph. So this is the scientific journal article that was published from this study in the journal Nature, which is a really fancy journal. So these people, this is really cutting edge research. So on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, you see years. They've been applying fertilizer to these plots since 1982. And then they kind of, this study was measuring it up through the year 2000. And then on the y-axis, you have just really a measure of plant growth. So higher values on that vertical axis mean that there's more plant growth. Lower values mean less plant growth. And so these are their results. So you can see the black squares and the line that goes through the black point, the square points. Those are plant growth in the plots that are fertilized through time, whereas the open circles are plots that are not fertilized, and they're just tracking background plant growth in those plots over time. And you can see that when you fertilize plots, the plants grow more. So again, that's kind of the quantitative, the numbers behind the picture that you see on the left here. In fact, the plants, when you fertilize them, do grow more, which, you know, is probably pretty intuitive, right? I don't know if you guys have gardens at home, or you know, if there are agricultural fields near where you live, you guys are probably adding fertilizer to your home gardens, or fertilizers being added to those crops to make them grow more. So beyond kind of this like idea of fertilization, where does nitrogen in soils naturally come from? If you took, you know, a plot of land where human impact is totally absent from that system, where does nitrogen in those soils come from? And the answer is really that it starts with the nitrogen in the atmosphere. So 78% of the air we breathe is nitrogen, but it's in this really hard to use form called N2. And that nitrogen is basically two nitrogen atoms that are really tightly bonded together with triple bonds, for those of you that have taken chemistry. So those are really strong bonds. And plants can't access that nitrogen because they can't break that bond and separate those two nitrogen atoms. So we need a way of getting the atmospheric nitrogen that's in the air, but we can't use it into a form in the soil the plants can use. And so we're trying to get from this N2 to this NH4+, it's ammonium. So I don't know if you guys have heard of ammonium. They're all kind of these similar types of nitrogen that plants can use. And there's actually some organisms that do that. So these are rhizobia bacteria. So those little tiny white nodules that you see on the roots of a plant are actually this bacteria that are kind of hired help for plants. So plants pay the bacteria some of the sugars that they make in photosynthesis. And then the bacteria in turn eats up those sugars, but also does this chemical reaction in these little nodules on the roots that turns this atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium. And that's called fixing nitrogen. So with the help of some microbes and a partnership involving trading kind of nutrients back and forth, this is how plants and natural ecosystems get nitrogen. They hire help, and it's a biological fixation process.
And Kenna, I wanted to just, we do have a few questions coming in, and some of these you can let us know if it's, coming up soon. Okay. But one question in the question and answer was, can there be too much nitrogen in soil, and can that be bad?
Yeah. So, it absolutely is bad. I see someone in the chat was talking about fertilizer runoff, running streams and rivers and lakes. And for those of you in Vermont, we have an example of that in our backyard, right? So because of agriculture, and the problem in Lake Champlain is actually related to phosphorus, but those are linked together. So commonly when you fertilize and you're adding nutrients, it's nitrogen and phosphorus. Those are the two nutrients that plants need most to grow. And when those run off, you do get eutrophication is what that process is called. And it is bad. But if you think about some of these natural ecosystems like the tundra I showed you in Alaska, there's no real fertilizer being applied other than in our experiments, of course, but those plants are very limited by the nutrients that they have available to them. And so you can see how limiting that that nutrient is by adding it to the system. So if you added nitrogen and the plants didn't grow very much more, you would know, like, okay, they have plenty of nitrogen in the soil and they don't need any more. So when we do talk about nutrient limitation, we're usually talking about natural ecosystems where we're not applying fertilizers for that exact reason, because in ag systems, too much fertilizer can lead to problems. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, you're right. It can be bad. Yeah, so back to this, so this is a perfect segue into, sure, we have these rhizobia and natural ecosystems that are helping plants get the nitrogen they need, but where do we get all of the nitrogen that we need for agricultural systems? And this is a story that starts with a German chemist around the time of World War I. So his name is Fritz Haber. He's a pretty weird looking dude there on the left. We won't judge his use of glasses too much. They probably aren't, up to our fashion standards now. But so around the turn of, the 20th century, around 1900, we're coming up on this problem as a world population. So this graph is going to kind of visually lay out this problem for us. So on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, again, we have time, 1900 through the year 2000. And on the y-axis, we have the world population. And so population in the world at this point in time is about 2 billion people. And we can't produce enough food to feed more people because we don't have nitrogen. Historically, fertilizer was manure, or sometimes you can rotate crops, which some of you might have learned about. But we've kind of hit the max capacity of using those historical techniques to add more nitrogen to the soil to grow more plants. And if we can't grow more food, we can't feed more people. And so everyone was kind of this arms race of how can we get all of this nitrogen that's in the atmosphere into a form that we can use to fertilize our crops. So they're trying to basically come up with a man-made way to mimic what the rhizobia in the soil do. So this, when I'm going to trigger the results on this graph, I want you to pay attention to the difference in the red dashed line and the black solid line. So 1900, turn of the century, we have 2 billion people, and we're kind of holding steady there. So in this graph, you can see that if we hadn't figured out a way to synthetically produced nitrogen fertilizer, world population in the year 2000 would probably be around 3 billion people, maybe a little bit more than that. But Fritz Haber designs this process called the Haber-Bosch process, which basically takes all of that nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, heats it up to a really high temperature, and puts a lot of pressure on the system. And that energy that he's using in that process breaks apart those nitrogen bonds. And if you add some water in there, then you get this ammonium fertilizer. So you get that NH4 instead of the N2 that plants can't use. And because of that process, it really just opened up the doors for population growth, because now we can synthetically fertilize. We can produce as much fertilizer as we need using all of this nitrogen in the atmosphere, and we can use that to grow more food. So if we didn't have the Haber-Bosch process, the world population would be half of the size that it is today. So this is a pretty monumental discovery and advancement in science that Fritz Haber enabled. And for that, he won the Nobel Prize in 1913, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work. But there's also kind of a darker side to Fritz Haber. He used, so 1913, what else is happening? World War I. And this is trench warfare, and it just seems like, if you imagine being at this moment in history, it seems like this war is just going to go on forever because people have just dug these trenches and they can't really, get at each other. And it's kind of just this stalemate. And so he also decides that he's going to help out the Germans in some way. So this is our next poll question of the afternoon. What else did Fritz Haber use the Haber-Bosch process to make? Do you think it's vaccines? Do you think that it's chemical weapons, cleaning products, or gasoline?
All right, and I did launch the poll, so results are coming in. Give another few seconds, get those guesses in. All right, so let's end the poll and I'll share the results.
Great. You guys nailed it once again. I was probably leaning, you picked up on my leaning heavily on the World War I association. And so unfortunately, Fritz Haber is this complicated guy because on the one hand, he figures out a process to make fertilizer, and you can feed a lot more people, alleviate a lot of global hunger. But then he uses the same process to make mustard gas. And so this launches the chemical weapons side of World War I. And this really terrible, I guess, use of this process that then killed a lot of people. So on the one hand, you're enabling a lot of people to live better lives and you're improving quality of lives, but then you're kind of allowing for mass casualties with this new weapon. So he is one of these really interesting figures in the history of science. And there's if any of you listen to Radiolab podcast, there's actually a really great episode that talks about these dueling sides of Fritz Haber. All right. And here's kind of an image of this trench warfare. So you have the people, gas masks were quickly developed because now it was kind of death by this silent agent in this trench warfare situation because of the mustard gas that Fritz Haber was able to develop. Okay, so on a lighter note, given that we now know about these natural ways that plants partner with microbes in the soil to naturally fix nitrogen. It also happens in the oceans, cyanobacteria, and lightning can also, when a lightning bolt strikes and it fizzles through the air, that energy can also break apart those really strong triple bonds in the nitrogen in the atmosphere. But we now know that there's also ways that humans can make nitrogen. And this is through growing different types of crops that were kind of harnessing that biological pathway. And of course, there's the Haber-Bosch process. And also your car, because there's so much nitrogen in the air, and your combustion engine's getting really hot, if some of that nitrogen in the air gets too hot, it breaks it out and releases nitrous oxide gases. So that's another way that nitrogen can be fixed into a plant available form. So in the chat, tell me if you think that humans or nature, so this left side of the column, nature, this right side of this table, humans, fix more nitrogen in total. I love Radiolab too, Jacob. Wow, so this is hard to tell. I feel like nature is maybe, 66, I'm gonna say 2/3 of the answers. You guys are saying nature, and maybe 1/3 of you think humans do. And the answer is that it's close. So your chat responses kind of resemble the reality of the situation, but humans do fix more nitrogen. And that's really owing in part to this Haber-Bosch process, and the kind of deploying these, taking advantage of these natural symbioses that allow crops to fix their own nitrogen. And interestingly enough, the Haber-Bosch process, I told you that, in order to make it all happen, you have to heat everything up to really high temperatures, and you also have to pressurize the gases in your tank. It uses 5% of the energy produced in the world. So that's a pretty big number. 5% of the total energy produced everywhere in the world is used to power the Haber-Bosch process to make nitrogen. So you can think about the impact of this process producing synthetic nitrogen in several ways. One, like kind of the carbon footprint of that process if it uses so much energy. And then the other, as many of you brought up in the chat and in your question about kind of the downside of fertilizer and overusing fertilizer where it pollutes other ecosystems.
And Kenna, did you see the question in the chat about, in that scenario, what does fix mean?
So fix means, it's kind of one of these weird words that ecologists that study these processes use. And it basically means turning nitrogen from this form that plants can't use that into in the atmosphere to a chemical form that they can take up through their roots. And so that's ammonium nitrate is a common one. So we say fix to mean basically chemically changing from N2 to NH4 to those plant available forms. Does that answer your question, Maya?
And I'm just going to put a reminder that certainly you can use the chat box too, but if you have questions that you're thinking, even if you just want us to answer them afterwards, just a reminder, there is that question and answer box as well. So I see that there are a few hands up. So if you have a hand up, definitely feel free to either message me in the chat or put it in the chat or the Q&A box. Thanks.
So there's one other way that nitrogen can become available to plants. Humans can fix nitrogen, nature can fix nitrogen, but there's also kind of a recycling system built into soil ecosystems, and we call this process mineralization. Have any of you heard of that? I don't know if you've studied the nitrogen cycle in some of your science classes yet, but have you heard of the process called mineralization before? See, lots of no's. It's pretty niche. Okay, great. So this, I'll just like really get into the nitty-gritty details here. So this graph has a lot of moving parts, a lot of arrows, a lot of circles, but really what I want you to focus on is these left kind of ellipses and the microbial biomass portion. So this is organic nitrogen pool. So that's basically, if you imagine plants obviously have some nitrogen in their leaves and in their stems, basically all up in the plant biomass. And as those plants die and decay, that nitrogen, which we call organic nitrogen, can be broken down, and you can separate out those individual nitrogen compounds, and once those compounds are broken down, mostly by soil microbes, that those nutrients can then be taken up again by plants. So plants don't discriminate against new nitrogen that's been recently fixed or this recycled nitrogen. And it's a way that once nitrogen is in the system, it can consistently just be reused to support future plant growth or growth of the microbes that are living in the soil. And so these are really important pathways in natural ecosystems, especially because there are only certain plants that can build these partnerships with the rhizobia in the soil. And so what are the other plants supposed to do? They can't partner with the microorganisms that are going to fix that nitrogen for them. So they need to be able to get it from the soil. And thankfully, through decomposition, that nitrogen is continuously becoming available as microbes break down dead plant material, essentially. And so, should have put this slide up earlier, but this box here highlights that we're focusing on this arrow that's taking nitrogen from the soil organic pool and putting it back down in these NH4, NO3, these plant available forms of nitrogen that then plants can take back up to grow again. And there's this interesting relationship between temperature, climate really broadly, and the rate of mineralization. So on this graph, these people Salmon et al. Have done this experiment where they've warmed up the soil and they're measuring how that impacts these nitrogen mineralization rates. So how fast are the microbes in the soil breaking down that organic matter and releasing plant available nutrients? And you can see in these gray bars that in plots that are warmed up, nitrogen mineralization is occurring faster. So these warmed plots are actually producing more nitrogen that is available to plants. So it's really just this physics, it's a physical phenomenon. So as it gets warmer, the microbes are just moving faster. These chemical reactions are occurring faster, and that's allowing more nitrogen to be released. So I want you guys in the chat to kind of go back to those plots I showed you guys at the very beginning, the screenshot of that Tuluc tundra fertilization experiment. Which plots do you think support more plant growth? The warmed plots or the control plots?
I'm seeing lots of votes for the warm.
You guys are exactly right. So really this comes down to the idea that if nitrogen is being recycled at a faster rate in these warmed plots in the gray bars, then there's going to be more nutrients available for the plants to grow. And so you're probably going to get more plant growth in these warmed plots. And this actually is exactly what I do in mountain ecosystems. So we use these things called open top warming chambers. So you can see them in this picture on the right. They kind of look like igloos that don't have a top on them, and they work like mini greenhouses essentially. So you have the plexiglass allows sunlight to get into the plots, but it kind of traps heat and insulates the plots in a way that raises the temperature in these plots. So we're talking about like 3 feet kind of diameter of these chambers. It heats the entire plant community and the soil by about 2 degrees Celsius, which is the predicted kind of magnitude of climate change. So we're using this experiment to take kind of a glimpse into the future. As these ecosystems warm up, how will the plant communities and everything happening in the soil, how will it change? And will these ecosystems look dramatically different, and will they function differently in a warmer world? And we've set on the left, you can kind of take a glimpse inside those chambers, and you see some of the instruments that we use, that we hike out into the field to measure different, like the carbon coming off the soil and other properties of the ecosystem. And we do this, the project's called WARM, because every project needs a catchy name in science. It's the Warm Climate Change Experiment, and it occurs at these 10 different sites around the world, and these are all in mountains. And we set up these warming chambers at both a high elevation and a low elevation site in each of these mountain locations. So what do you think, if you had to guess in terms of climate, so we're talking about temperature and precipitation, what are the main differences between being at the top of a mountain, a high elevation site, or being at the bottom of the mountain in a low elevation site? So what do you think are the main climate differences between the top and bottom of a mountain? Yeah, you guys are right. So temperature, tell me like a little more specifically, where do you expect temperature to be highest between those two sites? Yeah, so you just imagine, you know, if you guys have gone on hikes before, by the time you get to the very top, you're kind of putting your sweatshirt on, you're putting your beanie on, you're bundling up a little more because it's colder up there. And that's exactly why we take advantage of that temperature gradient in this experiment, because if you're at the top of the mountain and you're wondering, okay, how is this ecosystem going to look as it gets warmer with climate change? And to answer that question, you can kind of just walk down the mountain, because at the bottom of that mountain, it's growing in kind of the same conditions, the same general climate, the same plant species, but it's warmer down at the bottom of the mountain. And so we call this a space for time substitution, which sounds very Star Trek-y and futuristic, but it's essentially just using these natural temperature gradients to think about how climate change is going to impact an ecosystem. So I went to, well, I didn't go myself, but I got collaborators at each of these 10 different sites to send me soil samples back so I can measure the amount of nitrogen in the soil inside these warming chambers and outside the warming chambers. And so I'm going to show you results from 9 of the different sites. Before I do that though, I'm wondering if you guys have any guesses, if you want to just, you know, throw a guess out there about where you think nutrient concentrations are going to be the lowest of all these sites. If you had to just take a guess about, do you think they're going to be really low, maybe in Patagonia or in Greenland? Do you think the Swiss Alps are going to have really low nutrient concentration? Just like pick one of these sites and tell me where you think nutrient concentrations are going to be lowest. So you guys that are saying Greenland, I had the same thought too. I had the same thought, but I'm wondering why you think Greenland. Let's see if our hypotheses line up.
I'm also seeing some votes for Colorado.
Yeah, that is a good guess as well. And Sweden is also a good guess. And I think like Lily's response kind of applies to a lot of these places. It's colder there. So in Greenland and Sweden, in the Canadian Rockies, it's really cold. So you might think that, you know, if nitrogen cycling kind of speeds up when things get warmer, if it's really cold, there's probably really limited nitrogen there. I had the same hypotheses. And so I'm going to show you some of my results. So each of these 9 different panels is a different site, and you can see the title of the site to the left. And the blue boxes show control plots. So these are plots that are not warmed. We just are tracking nutrients in those plots without doing anything to the plots. And then the red bars are the warmed plots. And so on the y-axis, you have nutrient availability. So this is specifically nitrate. It's just one of those plant available forms of nitrogen. So higher values mean more nitrogen. And then there's also, you know, 4 different bars per location. And those indicate high elevation on the left or the low elevation on the right. So we already talked about the low elevation at most of these sites is warmer than the high elevation. And so initially in this first graph, this first set of graphs, the y-axis is the same, so it's the same scale. And so we can kind of get at this question that I posed to you guys, and we had made hypotheses about which site do we think is going to have the lowest nutrient concentration. And that's all these flat lines. It's so low that it's not even really popping up on these graphs and not even comparing to things like the USA, the Colorado Rockies. And I think you guys guessed all of these different low ones. So some said Patagonia, you're totally right. Argentina, really low nutrient concentrations. Greenland, same thing. Sweden and Switzerland are also really, really low. And so Switzerland actually kind of threw a wrench in our plans, because we were kind of sitting here thinking, well, what do Greenland and Sweden up in the high latitudes and almost the Arctic, what do those have in common with Switzerland and Argentina? And I'm going to show you this next graph, which is really just changing the scale of that y-axis, so you can see a little bit more about what's going on in those in Argentina, Greenland, Sweden, Switzerland. And we can see that warming actually in some of the sites, it does improve nitrogen availability. So this is that back to that experiment where they heated up the soil and they tried to track if there's faster or slower nitrogen cycling. And in some of the sites, we found the same result. So in France, Sweden, Switzerland, that red box is higher than the blue box. So that means that there's more nutrients in the warm plots than there are in the control plots that are not warmed. But that's not the case at every single site that we studied. In fact, in some sites like China, Sweden, and the US, it's actually lower. Sorry, Sweden is, should have moved that box. But in China and the US, you actually get less nutrients when you heat up those plots. And again, we're like, what is going on here? Why? And sometimes when you warm it up, nutrients respond one way, and other sites totally opposite. And you know, like this is what I've been spending my dissertation on. So props to you guys if you can even kind of like get at a piece of this answer. But why do you think that is? What do you think is going on here at these sites that's controlling how ecosystems respond to warming? Do any of you have any ideas? We can talk about your hypotheses. I'll give you a bit of a hint. So yeah, so that is a great, Emily says the plants have adapted to the conditions over time. So that is definitely one hypothesis, but the problem here is that the warming has only been going on for about 5 years. It's really not enough time for the plants to like get, you know, these adaptations to be able to like take advantage of the warmer climate. Jessica is saying maybe it's the soil, and Jack is saying maybe less of those bacteria that convert the nitrogen into fixed nitrogen. And those are all great hypotheses as well. Maybe something about the properties of these soils is kind of determining how these ecosystems respond to warming, or maybe it's something about the plant communities. And so I'm investigating some of these questions currently, especially this idea about how the plant community can affect the ecosystem response to warming. But kind of what we're thinking right now is that it's probably moisture. It's probably that other aspect of climate. So we know that temperature is really different in Greenland than it is in Switzerland, but there's also these gradients of precipitation. So the sites, I'm going to go back to this graph, the sites that have really low nutrient concentrations are actually really dry. And so we think that when you heat up ecosystems that are already really dry, you're kind of making those conditions even worse for the microbes in the soil that are responsible with recycling that nitrogen. And so maybe if you heat up a really dry ecosystem, you're going to have even less nitrogen than you started with. And that explains some of the patterns that we saw in the US and China, for example. So some quick take-home points from these slides are that, you know, nutrient concentrations are really different depending on where you are in the world. And why that is something we're still digging into today. And that's actually, you know, going to be some of the papers that come out of my dissertation. And the second point is that we kind of really think that it's this precipitation component that's driving some of the differences in how nutrient availability is affected by warming in different ecosystems. And so that is just a little bit about my research and tying it to nitrogen and this whole history of where nitrogen comes from and how humans are affecting that process. And so I would be happy to take any of your questions. And I want to thank you all again for coming to this presentation. And I've had a lot of fun talking with you all.
Yes, thank you so much, Kenna. So we definitely want to give you a chance to ask some more questions. But before we do that, we're going to launch a quick poll. We would love to get some feedback. It helps to inform our future teen science explorations. So I'm going to launch a poll, and it's just 2 questions. And if you would please fill that out, and then we'll head into some more Q&A. So the poll is live, and I'd love for you all to let us know what you think. And Kenna, I loved all the pictures of your travel. I feel like you could do a whole nother presentation on going to other countries and, you know, doing scientific experiments. And
it's been such a cool experience. I go through phases of just loving to do all this traveling. And again, like, these are trips that I definitely couldn't afford to go to Greenland by myself, but getting paid to do research in Greenland, you know, it's a great way to just explore new places and also contribute to scientific research. So for all of you people that have the travel bug out there or love hiking, you know, definitely think about some of these field research technician opportunities as maybe summer jobs or things like that to kind of scratch those itches for you.
Definitely. I did see, so I closed the poll. Thank you so much for the feedback. And there's lots of nice comments as well. I did see that Jessica L was hoping you could go back 1 slide to the last slide. And feel free to put questions in the question and answer box or the chat box.
That's what you were looking
Madison,
for.
Thank you. Great team. I'm sorry. Yeah, Jessica, just let us know if that's the one that you were hoping for.
Awesome.
Great. Lots of compliments coming in. It looks like a lot of the participants are inspired by not just the travel piece, but also that you get to do your work outside. Yeah. I think this
is where I spend my summers.
That's a magic niche there. All right, we have a question come in. So the first question is, how can we improve in our situation?
Yeah, I guess, so I'm going to assume that you kind of mean some of those results showed that if we heat things up, which is, you know, definitely a future that is really likely right now, global warming is happening as we speak. In some cases, it's going to really limit the amount of nutrients that plants have to grow. And so what can we do about that? Well, there's a lot of talk of, there's kind of a spectrum. So there are things that we can do. Some people believe, you know, ecosystems have adapted and kind of made it through some environmental conditions that are way worse than climate change. And so maybe we should just leave them alone because there are natural evolutionary processes and adaptations that can allow plant communities to themselves just shift to these new conditions. So that's one school of thought. Other people think that, you know, we do know that there are some of these plant species that do really well in these hotter, drier conditions. The problem is, you know, and maybe naturally through time, those plant species would start moving up the mountain. So, you know, there's plant species at the bottom of the mountain that occur in these hotter ecosystems already. And as things get warmer, they're going to just start moving up the mountain to kind of track their thermal happy spots. The problem is that climate change is happening so rapidly. It's kind of happening at a rate that is much faster than the ability of plants to kind of move up through time. And so some people think that we should start helping those plants out. It's called assisted migration. So we should start moving plants. Maybe we start planting or like sprinkling seeds of some of those low elevation plants and high elevation ecosystems to assist that kind of adaptation process. I kind of probably fall closer to the former way of doing things, that we have some glimpses into what might be driving how ecosystems respond to climate change, but we definitely don't know the full picture. And I think the more we keep messing with the ecosystems, the more we're likely to kind of break some of these really important ecological connections that we're totally missing. And we should just let the ecosystems kind of naturally evolve and adapt to climate change. So unfortunately, I feel like that's kind of probably the most commonly accepted. What do we do about this? I see Lily has asked, does nitrogen form lightning? Kind of the other way around. Nitrogen is just an element. So if you think of the periodic table, if any of you have studied the periodic table, it's just one of the over 100 different elements that we have naturally on the planet. So the nitrogen, the atmosphere is just N2. So it's two nitrogen atoms that are bound together. So that's a compound. And lightning can break that bond between those two atoms and release a different form of nitrogen, where those nitrogen atoms are now separated and they've combined with some oxygen in the atmosphere, and plants can take up that form. So that's kind of the relationship between lightning and nitrogen. And Victoria, what is your advice for getting scholarships, choosing a career, and traveling for research? I would say that you can start in high school even. We've had some high school students work in our research lab. We haven't been able to, travel internationally with some of the high school students, but they've worked with us in the lab and are learning some of the skills and some of the methods we use to measure nitrogen, for example. So you can start by, if you kind of have an idea of like some research that you like doing, take a look at some of the faculty pages at like the UVM website or the university that's in your hometown, and just email some professors. The worst they can say is no. Just say, hi, I am a student. I'm really interested in the work that you do, and I'm wondering if I could work in your lab or work with some of your graduate students, and just put some feelers out there. But definitely for those of you that are thinking about college, definitely just contact your professors that are teaching about different kind of areas of science that you really like, and ask them if they need research help. That's what I did, and it ended up with these, I ended up working with some of these professors that have these global climate experiments, and so that was how I was able to travel. And without those opportunities, I definitely would not have had some of the international experiences that I've been really fortunate to have. How can we address severe cases of people littering in nature? Yeah, that is definitely a problem, and we even see that at some of our field sites. So it's this kind of tricky situation between, you want people to really care about the ecosystems and share some of your values, but also sometimes it's about just finding out what's important to other people. So I might like the Colorado Rockies because of the beautiful wildflowers, or I really enjoy mountain biking in them. But someone else might really enjoy them for hunting, or maybe they enjoy the solitude going camping. So I think it's about having these conversations about people, with people, and finding common ground about why you care about these ecosystems. And then you can make these connections between, like if we don't take care of these ecosystems that we really care about, we might not be able to enjoy these things that we love doing in them. And so you kind of make those connections between, you care about this ecosystem, me too, let's work together to keep them healthy. Hope that answered your question. And we have one from Maya. What is your profession called? You know, it depends on the day. Sometimes I say that I'm a soil ecologist. So it's really broadly, I'm an ecologist. I study how nature interacts with its environment and what that means for kind of these big scale cycles of different nutrients. So sometimes I'll say I'm an ecosystem ecologist, and that kind of captures that scale component of it. Sometimes I'll say I'm a soil ecologist because I really do just study soil. Sometimes it depends on, who I'm talking to, right? Sometimes I just say I'm a scientist. So I don't think I've perfected that elevator pitch yet, like telling perfect strangers what I do, but it's constantly a work in process. What company do I work for? So I'm actually a PhD student at the University of Vermont. So internship opportunities, we definitely have, like I mentioned earlier, some high school students, some undergraduate students that work in our lab, and sometimes they can get summer funding through different University of Vermont grants for undergrads. And this is a common setup that will be at any university in your hometown. So if you live by kind of a university, contact professors and ask them, can I get involved in your lab? Can I get paid to be involved in your lab? That's another thing that can happen. Sometimes you have to put in a little bit of time of doing the grunt work of washing dishes and things like that before they're willing to pay you and let you do some of the fancier analyses, but it's worth it. Jessica asks, I know this is kind of a random question, but does nitrogen in the soil have any effect in wildfires? Does it help to feed wildfires, or does it help prevent wildfires? Most of the time when I think of nitrogen and fire, I think of it the other way around. Wildfires actually impact the nitrogen that's already in the soil, but you could think of, they are connected really indirectly. So if there's more nitrogen, there's more plant biomass, which potentially could mean more fuel in terms of the trees or the other plants that could be burned in a fire. So there might be that relationship between nitrogen and fire in that way, but I really think that relationship is mostly determined by climate. So if it's really hot and dry in an ecosystem, doesn't matter how much nitrogen's in the soil, that alone will determine wildfires.
These are great questions. Very interesting. I love
keeping me on my toes.
Yeah, all across the board, from topics as to, research on nitrogen to how you got to where you are. It's so important for us to hear stories of, I think when we're younger in third grade and people ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? You don't always know the name for your title. And just like you were saying, like your position title changes from day to day. And so it's really inspiring to see people like you who get to work on so many diverse projects. And I think Maya followed up in the chat, maybe to the profession question, because she said, okay, cool. And then asked, so you mainly study impacts on the planet or ?
Yeah, I study how global change, so this is just broadly climate change, invasive species, any kind of big change, mostly driven by humans, that's happening in an ecosystem, how it impacts the ecosystem. So kind of the planet, but definitely not that big of a scale, a smaller scale, meaning I definitely specifically focus on grasslands. So it's all of these alpine meadows that kind of are above the tree line in mountain ecosystems. So I study how all of these different global changes affect ecosystem health, really. That's how I would describe kind of the general theme of the questions that I study.
Yeah. And we have 2 more questions coming in.
Awesome.
First is, what things do humans do that make you really concerned in nature?
I think that a lot of what humans do that concerns me in nature is kind of falls along the lines of the leave no trace ethics. So I think that if you are hiking or camping or whatever you may be doing, walking your dog in nature, and it doesn't have to be like, I'm not talking about even just pristine natural, like national parks. You know, this could be the 1.5 mile loop outside through the woods in my neighborhood. I think that that all counts as nature, and we should all practice leave no trace in terms of don't, you know, if you see a cool plant, don't pick it and take it home with you. If, you know, if your dog uses the bathroom, pick that up and pack it out with you. If you have a tissue, don't just throw it out. Don't throw out your drink can in the nature, because like you are then negatively impacting the nature experiences of others. And I think especially now in a pandemic, when a lot of people are kind of going outside to find to get away from the stresses of sitting at a desk and kind of the isolation of social distancing, I think that it's even more important now for us to take care of nature, because it's kind of a lifeline for a lot of us. So I think that's what concerns me the most. And I try and do my part in, when I go on walks, I always pack out a piece of someone else's trash, try and leave this place, you know, cleaner than I found it. And I always practice like leave no trace myself. So someone else asked, does nitrogen affect animals? That is a great question. And it does actually. So I talked mostly about how nitrogen impacts plants and is used in chlorophyll, but nitrogen is actually the building block of proteins. And proteins, you know, you might think of protein as in the nutritional facts on the back of your food, where it says how much protein is in your protein bar, something like that. And we, you know, we need protein to build our muscles, but proteins, you know, biologically are essentially every little component of our cells. Cells are just kind of sacks of millions of proteins, and those proteins carry out every single function that our cells do. So we need we need nitrogen in that capacity, and we get our nitrogen instead of having these, you know, partnering with bacteria to fix nitrogen, or we don't fertilize ourselves. We just eat the plants that have taken up this nitrogen, and that's how we get our nitrogen. But it is just as important for humans or for animals as it is for plants.
Excellent. Well, we're at 4:43. If anyone has a really burning desire for one final question, we'll field that. But otherwise, I think we've grilled you with some good questions. And thank you to all of our participants who came out and have stayed on for the questions, very engaged, and we loved hearing from all of you. So Kenna, thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope you guys have a great afternoon and evening.